Good morning, everyone.
Morning, all.
Morning.
Morning, I think that's everyone connected. Morning, Stephen. Nice to meet you finally.
Hello, I'm here.
Yes. Whereabouts are you just now?
Still on the vessel.
Okay.
7 weeks in. So, yeah. Hopefully get home soon.
I mean, you're not missing much. We're still locked down and it's still pretty big. So there's no an awful lot going on.
We're stuck in a bank of fog at the moment, just waiting on the pilot, and then should finish up next week.
And then are you back into port for a little while?
4 weeks and then on for another 7. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let everyone make their introductions. Obviously we've spoken by email. I'm Janet and I run the CPD Centre at the university. And then James is joining us today to lead the session with Simon. So James works for the South Lanarkshire Planning Authority, specialising predominantly in wind farms. I believe that's what you mainly deal with. And then Simon is one of the co-creators of this course, but he works in industry and he works or runs an organisation called Naturally Compliant. So I'll pass over to maybe your co-delegates can introduce themselves just for the benefit of James and for Steve as well. So maybe Rebecca, you could start.
Yeah, sure. I'm an environmental consultant and I work for an engineering firm. But I used to be, so I mainly work on major infrastructure projects now, more from a desk-based position. My background is sort of water management, and I'm chair of the Association of ECALs.
And then maybe on to Mike.
Morning, everyone. I'm Michael. I am a landscape architect by trade, working for a company called Sistra. We specialise in infrastructure projects, particularly high-speed rail. I've also sort of come from a background of environment agency and working on sort of large flood management schemes as well as infrastructure planning and NSIPs and that kind of thing. So.
Okay, and
Hello. Sorry, I've moved house and the lighting isn't great in here, so sorry that it's a bit dark. We don't really have any room. I'm Beth. I'm an environmental scientist at Binnies. We were formerly Black and Beach. I'm quite a generalist role. I'm quite new to work. Been working for about 2.5 years, mainly in flood alleviation projects is mainly what I work in.
okay, and Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Stephen. My background is a marine biologist. I did my bachelor's in marine biology at the University of Liverpool. Then I went on to do my master's in marine planning and management. And since then, I've been working offshore for the past 11 years. So I'm like the feet on the ground, the clever people in the office, write all the methodology, and I'm the person who sits on the boat. And yeah, so at the moment, I'm on Hornsey 2 wind farm, putting into place the marine mammal mitigation on the Innovation, the vessel, the Innovation. But yeah, environmental scientist roles, yeah, do whatever I'm asked to do. I'm a freelancer, so yeah.
And what has driven you to take this course? Obviously, you've been kind of remotely alongside the rest of the group up to this point, but what was your motivation for wanting to join this course with the Environmental Clerk of Works?
To be honest, I don't want to work offshore anymore. I spend too much time at sea. I must average around 7-8 months a year at sea, and yeah, I want to start a family, so I'm trying to think of a way out, to be honest. So yeah, this is the first step. This is the first step. Rebecca might know a company that I used to work for called CMAX in Eastham. No?
In Eastham?
Yeah, it used to be in Eastham. It's been taken over by NIRAS now. But yeah, you from the Wirral?
Yes. How did you know that?
I can tell by your accent, and I've been watching watching the lessons.
Yeah, I'm from Parkgate.
It was a little environmental consultancy in Eastham called the Centre for Marine and Coastal Studies, and I did a lot of freelance work for them.
Okay.
I'm living in.
I've not lived on the Wirral for 25 years, but I am from, I moved away just obviously with university. My dad's still there, so I do still go back to the Wirral, but I've not actually lived there for quite a long time.
Yeah, I've just moved to Chester. I love it.
Nice. Very nice.
We had someone on the last course who, I'm from Kent originally, and someone on the last course was I could place her accent immediately, because she was clearly from a very, very close town to me in Kent, and you can just hear it, I think, even if you've been away for years, it's softened immeasurably. There's just always that kind of little trait in there. But it's great to have back on the course. What I'll do is I'll pass over to Simon, and maybe he can sort of set context for this session, and then we'll get started with James. And I'll still be here if you've got any questions. Just drop anything in the chat, and I'll be listening as well. Should be about somewhere around an hour and a half this morning, I would have thought. I'll pass over to Simon.
Thanks, Janet. Hello, everyone. Nice to you, Stephen. I think this is the first session I've been on since the first session of this course. So it's good to see everybody again. I guess the topics that we've looked at up until now have been quite technical, in that it's like the waste and resource management or materials management, and sort of water management, pollution control and things. And SEPA's presentation last week, but we will speak to SEPA a bit later. But this is really a very important part of the course, and providing context for why we've run the course. So certainly in Scotland, it's our experience that the environmental clerk of works role, as we see it, or sometimes called the ecological clerk of works role, which is a bit different to the role that's specified in England. But the environmental clerk of works role that we see in Scotland, and has been sort of moving down into England through the Environment Agency, primarily comes from the local authorities. So the requirement for an environmental clerk of works will come from the planning condition for that. So we're delighted to have James here to talk us through where they see the environmental clerk of works role coming from, and why they feel it's important, and then provide a bit of context about how they use the planning conditions to achieve that goal, and then sort of talk through a few problems that they have themselves with the industry and the sector and things. So yeah, super happy to have somebody from the LPA to be able to talk us through it as part of the work that we're doing with IEMA at the moment, and the impact assessment part of things. What we're looking to do is create a standardized environmental clerk of works definition, which will then be passed through the local authorities, including in England. So we'll have a standardized role for assurance, which is what the environmental clerk of works role, as we understand it to be, is there to do. So just to provide assurance that everything is going the way that it should do. So we'll let James go, and then we can have a really good discussion about the potential problems and the good parts of what we're trying to achieve, and see what comes from that. So James, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Simon. I was hoping to share my screen with a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's
me
saying.
James, and I'll set that up for you.
Thank you. Oh, that must be. It's not an exciting PowerPoint. So, I don't quite know if. This...
Try that now.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. So thank you very much. So yes, I'm James Wright. I'm a planner for South Lanarkshire Council. I deal with all our large-scale environmental planning applications and also contribute to our development plan team by helping write our planning policy and guidance. I'm aiming just to give a brief overview of my role and an introduction into planning, as well as my experience with ECO. Firstly, it should be said it's great to be invited to things like this, because as a planner, I'm always worried about a disconnect between planners and some stakeholders. And I think the ECO role is something that planners maybe don't have a full understanding of. And so whilst this is meant to be a brief overview on planning, I think it's good to highlight this at the start. I think it'd be good to start thinking of the roles and experiences you've had on projects and the benefits they can bring to us as one of the regulators. I was asked to keep my presentation to about 20 minutes to allow time for discussion. And I think we're all pleased I've definitely managed to keep it under this time. So firstly, I thought I'd just give a simple introduction into both my role and the planning process in general. Planning can be considered to be in two separate parts. Firstly, development planning, which is the section of planning that publishes the local development plan, which sets out the vision, objectives and strategy that guide future development proposals within the council area. Hopefully the slide is clear as it sets out the hierarchy of development planning. Firstly, you have the legislative provisions in the Planning Acts, which set out requirements for each council to prepare their own local development plan for the next 5 years. Although a third Planning Act has just recently been introduced, and one of the changes in this is extending the plan period to 10 years. And then at a national level, policy is set out within the National Planning Framework and Scottish Planning Policy. The National Planning Framework identifies where the national priorities for investment should take place to support the government's strategy for sustainable economic growth. Currently, we're on the third edition of the National Planning Framework, but the government is working on the fourth edition, which is expected to be published next year. Scottish planning policy focuses on how development is actually delivered to achieve this successful sustainable economic growth, and it is also currently being reviewed, and a new edition should also be published next year, although this will now sit within the National Planning Framework itself rather than being a standalone document. And then sitting under this national policy, there's a strategic level of policy for separate city regions, which is intended to provide high-level strategic guidance for the councils within each plan area, and this strategy is then designed to shape the local development plan.
Sorry, James, can I just jump in quickly? Obviously, this is very Scottish focused and specifically on South Lanarkshire, but the process, so the theory behind all that is the same throughout the UK at the moment. They are doing an EIA legislative review down in England at the moment. So that might change off the back of that review. But in theory, that process is the same throughout the UK. Yeah. I think, is that right?
I mean, there's nuances, but in the main, it's roughly the development plan process for all.
Just misses out the regional section, I think.
I think
national to local.
There's also then they have the kind of unitary authorities and minerals. So, but I must admit, I would struggle speaking about Scotland as it is, let alone if we drawn out. So that's definitely for another day, I'm afraid. But broadly, the main thrust is in the UK, it's a plan-led system. So there's some form of development plan that we then have to kind of assess the applications against. So I'll keep going if that's all right, unless anyone's got anything else. So again, feel free just to butt in, because this is, as you may have noticed, it's quite a dry me reading from a piece of paper, because I'm not a fantastic speaker. So definitely just feel free to voice up as I go along. So each council has to produce its own local development plan. Each plan is required to undergo full public consultation, including a stage where developers and landowners can propose sites they wish to be included for development within the plan. And following this consultation and assessment, the council drafts their version of the plan and submits it for examination by Scottish ministers. The examination allows for site selection to be reassessed as well as amendments to policy. Following examination, the amended plan is then approved and the new plan period begins. The local development plan is normally topic specific with policies on the environment, retail and housing, and so on. My role involves the writing of the policies relating to the environment and then specific policies relating to minerals, renewables and waste. So here we have the second part of planning, which is development management, and this deals with determining planning applications. And so up in Scotland, Section 25 of the Planning Act requires all planning applications to be assessed against the local development plan, and therefore the development plan is a primary consideration when assessing an application. And again, that's the same as for England and Wales. So development management is the main portion of my role, and it's the one I find most interesting. The applications I deal with are normally large-scale EIA developments such as quarries and wind farms. Development management involves the assessment of each application and involves consultation of statutory consultees such as SEPA, Nature Scot and Environmental Services, as well as sometimes involving community councils and bodies such as the RSPB and Scotways. Applications are also advertised to allow public engagement, which could lead to objections being submitted. Small-scale applications and ones attracting less than six objections can usually be signed off within the planning office. But for large-scale applications or ones that attract 6 or more objections, the decisions must be made by the planning committee, which consists, in my case, of 15 South Lanarkshire councillors, and they sit once a month. The planning committee meetings are public, and decisions are based on recommendations made by myself and other planners. Any refusal of planning permission requires to have a clear set of reasons on why it merited refusal, and then if an application is approved, it can either be approved unconditionally or more likely with a suite of planning conditions attached. So as well as planning applications, another part of my development management role is being a statutory consultee to the Scottish Government when an application for a wind farm is made to them under the Electricity Act. If a wind farm has a generating capacity of more than 50 megawatts, the consenting regime is different from planning permission, and in these circumstances, the council is a statutory consultee, and rather than approving or refusing the wind farm, we provide a consultation response on our views of the proposals. If we object, the Scottish Government are required to hold a public local inquiry before they can make any decision. If we do not wish to object, we would normally recommend what planning conditions should be attached to any consent if issued. If the government then approved the development, the decision is in 2 parts, with conditions under their control relating to the Electricity Act, but also with a suite of planning conditions that fall within the control of the council. Normally, this would include any environmental provisions, such as the employment of an eco. So that's just a very brief overview of planning and my role. So I thought it was worthwhile just to set out a bit of background of where we are in South Lanarkshire in relation to onshore wind, which is where my experience of eco has come from.
Over 50 megawatts, does that go to planning inspectorate then, or Secretary of State?
I must admit, in Scotland, the Scottish Government have their own section called the Energy Consents Unit.
Right.
And they, if it's over 50 megawatts, they deal with it. But if we, as a consultee, object, that actually goes to the DPA, which is our version of the inspectorate.
Inspectorate, so, right.
Yeah, and that's the same as England. They still are the ones that make decisions based on, if there's a kind of objection raised by the local planning authority. But I must admit, I think it's similar down in England, but we have what's called the Energy Consents Unit, and it's 3 teams of maybe 10 people that kind of assess all electricity applications and large-scale pylons for the whole of Scotland. So that's who we respond to when it's over 50. And to be fair, we're finding more and more everything is getting over 50 in terms of wind.
Well, yeah.
So which is why it's quite good, because we've a good working relationship with them, and actually one of their team leaders used to be the senior doing the wind farms when I was just doing minerals and waste. So it's quite handy knowing you can just own someone, and also the fact that she knows the system. So.
Excellent. Cheers.
No problems. So yes, so we currently, South Lanarkshire currently has 18 operational wind farms, with 3 more under construction. We also have a further 7 wind farms that have received consent either through ourselves, the Planning Commission, or by the Scottish Ministers through the Electricity Act. In total, we currently have approximately 1,600 megawatts of consented capacity within our area, which means we're one of the main locations of wind energy in Scotland. It's South Lanarkshire's Scotland's first commercial wind farm, Hagshaw Hill. This wind farm began operating in 1995, so it's now reaching the end of its 25-year permission. We've therefore experienced quite a lot of wind farm development. This has led us to implement certain planning processes that we feel give us confidence in dealing with large-scale wind farm applications. I thought that the most relevant one of these would be our use of planning monitoring officers, who they monitor site construction through to the final decommissioning of the site. A planning monitoring officer's role is to check compliance with all conditions of a planning permission. So whilst this does include all environmental mitigation, it's not limited to just this, and also includes things such as assessing the restoration liability of the site in relation to the bond quantum, ensuring traffic management has been implemented, and ensuring all buildings are in the right place. Whilst using a PMO works well for us to effectively monitor a site's compliance with planning conditions, the remit is very broad given the range of planning conditions themselves. The PMO is effectively carrying out the site audit that myself or my enforcement officer would carry out if we had the time and resources to do so. So whilst normally a PMO is from a multidisciplinary consultancy, where there is a high depth of knowledge of environmental and ecological matters, this is not actually within their remit, and on site these matters should remain with yourselves as ECO. I'm always concerned that planners confuse the expertise of each role rather than seeing them as being complementary, but each with separate remits and reporting responsibilities. I think there's still an element of confusion in planning as to the exact role of ECO, and that needs to be addressed. So was there no? Sorry. So I think there's still an element of confusion in planning as to the exact role of ECO, and that's something that needs to be addressed. This includes in planning conditions where the role of ECO needs to be stated clearly and concisely to avoid any misinterpretation. So this slide shows a recent condition we've used in relation to ECO, and in this instance, this is one we recommended to the Scots Government as part of the consenting process under the Electricity Act. The Scots Government are happy with the use of ECO through condition and always attach it to the planning permission element, so it's under the Council's control. I've highlighted what I think are the relevant parts of the condition. The first highlighted part is the use of environmental clerk of works, a bit like what Simon was saying earlier, as ecological may not always be the appropriate specialism, whereas we feel environmental, in planning terms, can encompass any of the monitoring required under parts A and B of this condition. This definition of an ECO is one of the concerns I have regarding a possible disconnect between planning and the role of an ECO. I feel that there may be a misunderstanding of what the remit of an ECO is. There's the obvious issue over the varied specialisms that can be within the environmental badge and in the ecological badge. And I think there's an overarching problem to this, where ECO is referenced as part of the mitigation measures set out within the EIA, and therefore there's a presumption made by planners that an ECO is responsible for the implementation of all these measures rather than an inspection and compliance role on site. The Planning Authority also approved the appointment of the ECO, and whilst it's in consultation with SEPA, if the role is misunderstood, is the right appointment being made in terms of what specialisms are relevant to the particular site? Personally, I've been quite fortunate that all the appointments that have been proposed to me are from large multidisciplinary consultancies with a proven track record of sites. But I'm always concerned that my own lack of knowledge could potentially result in not being confident in agreeing to a perfectly suitable candidate who's maybe just newly qualified and independent. I think that's where more interaction can only be positive for both our professions. And again, that's why I feel like things like being invited here today are really important. And so finally, you'll be pleased to hear, for planning to try and gain a better understanding and experience of the ECO process, the Energy and Resources subgroup of Heads of Planning Scotland has set up a working group on ECO. Whilst led through Heads of Planning Scotland, the working group is made up of members from local authorities like myself, key agencies such as SEPA and Nature Scot, and the Energy Consent Unit, as well as members from your professional association such as Simon and Rebecca. So whilst at an early stage, the aim of the working group is to clearly define the role of ECO for planners. This will hopefully lead to a review of current planning conditions to try and capture what is actually required on site and therefore controlled through an appropriate condition. I'm hopeful that through the group we can establish clear guidelines on ECO's role and how planning can facilitate and benefit from this. Ultimately, the aim is to also publish guidance for planning authorities to ensure that the ECOW role is understood and to give planners confidence in knowing what to expect from the role. So yeah, just thanks for patiently listening to me, and apologies as it's quite a dry subject, but I'd really be interested in any thoughts and feedback you might want to discuss, as well as being happy to try and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I think for me, you seem to think that that's quite a dry subject, but having been involved in this industry for the last 7 years, it's absolutely fascinating to try and figure out how everything works and how everything should, in theory, fit together. So obviously we've got the ES making a whole range of commitments. And before I get into my questions, we'll probably put it out to the rest of the group.
I think it's interesting, the highlighted elements on the recent condition. I mean, it's all about monitoring compliance and taking note of any non-compliance, and that's the kind of, I think that's the kind of message you need to drill home, that the environmental clerk of works isn't necessarily undertaking any of these works. It's simply monitoring the compliance of the workforce on site. Not necessarily a question, just
Sorry, Stephen, did you have a question there?
Yeah, just what Mike was saying then, it is difficult. When we're working on here, our job is to monitor compliance with conditions of consent, and sometimes when you're speaking to people on board, they wonder why you're here, and they ask for environmental advice and expect you, like with the other lectures, going beyond your scope. And yeah, it's difficult not to do that, not to give advice, and yeah. So
I suppose it's just making sure that you don't give any bad advice or any advice that comes from no background knowledge. Like, I mean, I'd be fully confident in giving advice on landscape matters, but perhaps not sort of waste on site, for example. But it's knowing who to turn to, which environmental specialist to turn to in that event, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested about enforcement and fines from a planning perspective. I mean, people who've got a reasonable amount of experience under the belt will know that pretty much every single site is highly non-compliant from an environmental perspective, as a sweeping generalisation. But what sort of system do you need to go through in terms of non-compliance? I mean, how does that all work? Because I think, for me, having sort of been quite jaded and cynical about the whole kind of effectiveness of the role, I think enforcement needs to be much, much more present, and big, massive financial fines. I'm working on a project now where they've told me it will be an environmental disaster because they're not going to have basically the contracts in place to make it work from an environmental perspective. So we've been trying to sort of discuss with contractual specialists about non-conformances, and they know that they basically already admitted, the contractual manager has admitted that they don't have, basically they'll write non-conformances until they're blue in the face, but it won't make any difference. So they know there's going to be a major environmental disaster because the non-conformances aren't effective either. So how and when, basically projects are, in my experience, projects are relying on the planning authority and on other regulators to identify non-compliance, and operators and developers will basically work quite close to the wire or over it until a regulator picks it up, because they're not really giving the authority or the autonomy to the monitoring people to have that feedback mechanism. So there is feedback mechanism is there, it just doesn't have any teeth. So basically, contractors essentially, and developers as well to a certain degree, are operating way over where they should be, and knowingly, because they're not likely to be prosecuted. Do you get involved in many, how does enforcement work from your perspective, and is it successful?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say, first of all, that's one thing where there's a massive difference between England and Wales versus Scotland. while it's not perfect, England and Wales have much better enforcement powers than we do in Scotland. In Scotland, if there's a breach of planning permission reported to us, the first thing we have to do is challenge that breach and not allow them to apply for planning permission to rectify it. And that's why if we find it's on a site and it's something either environmental, pollution related, or something that maybe affects protected species or things like that, we would actually prefer it if we would report that to Nature Scotland or CEPA, because they do have slightly better powers in terms of stepping in immediately and stopping fines. Whereas the planning system in Scotland is designed that we're fully open to, if we issue a stop notice, that can be challenged and we have to then provide compensation for any business lost. So it's not used much up in Scotland. So as I say, what we do is we challenge on a breach of condition, but by the time that's been issued and they write to us, they could say, yeah, we were preparing a planning application. You know, the actual matter on site, it's something that yeah. So I have to say, and again, I'm sure it's not perfect down there, but we're quite envious of the powers that are in enforcement down in England and Wales. So it might be that there's a better mechanism down there, but up here, we really, I mean, toothless is the word I'd, describe us sadly. And that's why we really have to work closely when we find breaches from the plan reported to us, to go straight to CEPA and Nature Scotland, because their legislation's more overarching and can be dealt with a bit quicker than ours.
Right.
So it's not the best answer, but sadly that's the reality of what it is.
Yeah, so it's not very effective then in terms of enforcement.
No, I mean, I think the effectiveness is us having planners who know that you can go direct to someone at CEPA, someone at Nature Scotland. That's the crux, because our environmental legislation is slightly better, in my opinion. But also sometimes just sending an enforcement, I mean, my enforcement officer is ex-policeman, so sometimes sending him out onto the site is very effective, but not everyone has that, sadly. But no, I think that's something, but there is an acknowledgement that enforcement needs to be looked at in the whole of planning, even for house extensions all the way up to large wind farms. So it's something that is being looked at, but we really need to start trying to be a bit more progressive on that.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that as well? When we do have a non-compliance and we're unsure, we report that to the developer. We don't report that directly to the regulator. So, in my opinion, you report it to the environmental department of the developer, and I think that's open to all kinds of things. They choose what they put forward, So we report it. We say, okay, this is what we see. We tick it off, and you can work for people who are very much on board with everything that you suggest and you advise. And then there's others who just, like, especially when working abroad, they won't take any notice whatsoever. And then it's the developer who decides what they put forward, what reports to be issued. So it's
amazing the compliance rates on those sorts of jobs, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, HS2 is another one. We working on at the minute, and again we would report to the developer, which is HS2 themselves. So they're also they're the developer and the regulator almost, in many ways, which brings about difficulties. So
we have that. I'm particularly suffering at the moment because I work out with essentially the planning, because it's major infrastructure projects, so Transport Scotland jobs. And those jobs are, as Simon knows, are so far behind even now private practice. It's like they're operating, another generation behind. And there's they work under roads orders. So trying to get Transport Scotland, for example, to take responsibility. And this is why there's major problems on the roads jobs, because basically they leave everything to the contractor completely and utterly. So the contractor has their own ECAL team, and what Transport Scotland don't really understand yet, but they will do shortly, is that an independent ECAL who's been commissioned by the contractor to report on the contractor's compliance is not an independent ECAL, because the contractor's paying their salary and also, reporting directly back to them, which is two key elements there. But then Transport Scotland say, well, we don't want to get involved with that because it's a roads order and it's out with the planning system effectively. They're massively keeping their distance from it. And I guess it's the same for like HS2 and these other mega infrastructure projects where they kind of sit outside the normal kind of planning system, really. It's all very incestuous, really, how they're managed, because it's all just within a little bubble, or a very big bubble, as the case may be. There's no external kind of scrutinization, I think.
I think penalties should be set out and be, okay, it shouldn't be this may happen or this may happen. It should be, this happens, this what's going to happen. It's going to hit you in the pocket, or next time you apply for a license, it's going to be a lot more.
Oh.
Well, it could, in the guidelines, it could lead to financial penalty. It could, but it needs to be more.
It needs to be more definite. Yeah, I think I agree with you. It needs to be more precise, really, doesn't it?
Well, we've set out, basically, you have to, it's absolutely critical for the system to work that you define what non-compliance is. And I come up against these arguments where they say, well, non-compliance is, non-compliance with legislation or, really obvious things. But then what we're saying is you need something clear and concise to define it, whether it's, because we read reports, which are like, last environmental review report I read was 65 pages long. And I thought, who's going to read that for one sub-project? What you need is a tabular kind of assessment, quick assessments, which people can actually use, which are basically clear and concise. And then also the implications of if you break these, if you breach these, then there will be a penalty. That doesn't seem to how it works on roads jobs, to be honest. But we've basically said you need to have a framework to make this assessment, for it to sit within. So you can then go on and clearly say, right, this is not subjective because you've clearly breached it. Here's the evidence. Here's the quantification of the data. So now there's going to be a penalty. But yeah, I mean, it's
on the side of the developer, sometimes these conditions can be very prescriptive and hard to follow, and sometimes near on impossible to follow. So again, it's all about clarity.
Yeah, it's the nuts and bolts, I think, of the roles. Have you got your planning condition there, James? Can we have a look at that again?
Just while James is bringing that up, I found out yesterday that there's an Environmental Standards Scotland. It's like an ombudsman has just been set up.
Really?
Looking at whether environmental enforcement is fit for purpose.
Oh wow!
Now of now that Brexit's happened, basically. And I think there's something similar in England. I can't remember what it's called, but basically, yeah. So they're going to be looking at whether the environmental enforcement options available are working or are fit for purpose. So that's something that we can maybe look at from a planning perspective as well. Like, how do we make it easier for the planning authorities to enforce it?
Yeah.
And the fact that you are potentially liable for issuing a stop order, that's obviously no council in their right mind is going to issue a stop order if they're liable for works delay.
Make it more difficult for them to be challenged on that then, and until you figure out whether or not there is a breach.
Yeah.
So take away any element of liability from the planning authority until we know that whether they were right or wrong in stopping.
The liabilities associated with the stop works, though. So if the work's going, someone's got to pay for that. If it's a person, and the person who said stop is going to be the person who pays for it. But we have discussions internally where basically we've created a system where the developers essentially know that they will be cheaper and better for them to just crack on and operate the way they see fit, rather than in a compliant manner per se, because the system just isn't there to support it. But what I was interested on this slide is, for me, something which we're looking into in association is the independence. independent clerk of works, like what does that actually mean from a definition perspective? Because I personally have a bugbear with it in terms of everyone says, well, the ECOW is independent because they're from a separate company, but I've been personally in a very awkward position where you are, you know, essentially commissioned on that basis, but because you're reporting, like Stephen was saying before, if you are in a very impartial position. So independent to me means not being paid directly by that company as well. And then you're actually not influenced by them at all. But I think that's, you know, we've touched on that separately, haven't we, in the planning group?
It's, from a personal point of view, sometimes as well in our roles, in a compliance monitoring role, it might be asked for by the developer that you're actually on a different boat than the installation vessel. So they may say, okay, put the NMOs or the PAM operatives or whoever on a guard vessel instead. They want us away, you know, out of sight. And they get their own way a lot of time. Yeah.
They probably get more their own way offshore than they do onshore.
Yeah.
So is this a regular condition that you apply quite a lot, James?
I must say, yes. I'm not going to suggest it's perfect though, so feel free to pick it apart. But I mean, the independent thing is quite a big thing, because I suppose to explain for our planning monitoring officers, we employ them, but we then recharge the applicant, but we have to sign that into a legal agreement. That's why it's not dealt with via condition. And we're more confident with that, because then we know that the planning monitoring officers report directly to us. We see the reports first.
So why doesn't the ECOW arrangement work like that?
Well, again, that's something that, and maybe it's as part of the work group, is to work to see if that's the way we should be moving. Because then I think also there's maybe the ECOW that's mentioned in the EIA mitigation, the ECOW that would be doing as part of this planning condition, you know, should we look at them separating that? But again, that's where I feel it's really good to start all these discussions, because I would say planning, and you know, for someone who deals with the majority of applications that require things like that, I mean, I would never stand up and say I have a full handle on it. So that's why I think this working group being set up, and the Association of ECOW yourself, it really is something that I think we've just maybe muddled through in planning, and now we actually, you know, I don't like putting a condition on just because someone thinks, oh, it looks, that's what you should have, and then I get a report once every month that, you know, just says it's fine. I would like the condition to actually result in, well, A and B, to ensure that that's been carried out.
And do you, from a planning perspective, do you only include a condition for ECOWs if the environmental statement says an ECOW will be provided? Like, what's the trigger mechanism?
No, and again, and that's because it's always hard trying to put thresholds, because I might actually look at an application that's not had anything mentioned and put it on because I think it's necessary. But that's only because I've 15 years of experience of dealing with, you know, someone sitting even in South Lanark's, I'm in headquarters there in the local office, may not even think of it, you know. So again, that would be quite a good thing to look at, is should certain projects automatically have one?
Yes.
But not that it has to be built into an EIA, but the planning authority should be using the condition.
Yeah. So from my own experience, for example, and this is when I thought about it quite a lot 2-3 years ago, was I worked on a project. So our engineering firm was basically doing the civils designs for a new, I mean, they called it a new village, but it was a new town. It's like 1,000 houses. And in the ecology chapter of the EIA, which we didn't do, it was a completely different company, they didn't say that an environmental or that there was no role provided as part of the mitigation. And that, to me, just jumped out, because we were, as a team, from a watery team, we were saying a hydrological clocks of work should be provided, and that should sit within an ECOW team. But then there was no ECOW team suggested, and the ecologist was saying, nah, it'll be fine because it's not near any sensitive areas, but we were like, it's 80 hectares of, you know, like an enormous amount of exposed ground. I mean, it was a phased development over the next sort of 6 years. And we were like, how can you not, just because there isn't like a triple SI downstream, you know, and that's when I started looking into it and speaking to different people about, well, what is the trigger level of where an ECAL, and if an ECAL isn't included in the environmental statement, when does the planning, how does the planning authority make that judgment whether to include one or not? There's probably one for SNH as well, or Nature Scott, or Natural England. Is it driven by environmental statements? Simon, you know quite a lot about EIAs.
Yeah, so well, we've done quite a bit of research into this, and typically most ecology chapters, if they deem a sufficient risk, will talk about an ecological clerk of works. And then when you're in for or you go into the hydrology chapter, they'll talk about an environmental clerk of works. And then the correlation between Nature Scott now, so the study was only in Scotland, but Nature Scott, who are the Natural England version, English Natural England, they would, in their response to the EIA, would say, we agree with the use of an ecological clerk of works, whereas SEPA wouldn't say anything about an environmental clerk of works. So the EA version wouldn't say that. And then the correlation between the ecological clerk of works being the condition and the planning in the suite of conditions was very high. So what people are writing into the ES is vitally important, because that's typically what goes through to the planning conditions. Maybe not with Southland and James looking at a wider picture and having a better understanding, but it does really influence what goes into the development. One of my questions was, James, so in an ES, all the mitigation in theory should be implemented onto the project. You've made your decision based on the mitigation being put forward. But I mean, water management is obviously one of the biggest problems on shore. And within the hydrology chapter, they'll talk about sediment pollution, and they'll just say, oh, the contractor will design a pollution prevention plan, and we'll use silt fences and hay bales, and that will be it. Is there because we spoke about enforcement, and you're not having much teeth, but you do have a lot of teeth in being able to reject the application. So could we, as part of is there an argument to improve awareness within the planning, or the people determining planning applications, that certain throwaway statements about environmental matters and mitigation, can we upskill those and say, well, that's not going to work? And then through your powers of being able to object to it, could you say, well, actually, we don't think your water pollution prevention strategy is fit for purpose, so we want something more. And until you give us that, we're not going to accept the proposal. So I don't know if that's maybe a way around the enforcement situation.
I suppose, again, in planning, we're beholden to what advice SEPA has given us as consultee. But first of all, and also when it's the Section 36 electricity ones, SEPA go direct to the government, so we don't have even input in that. But I think there needs to, I think it'd be good if there was a better understanding of environmental management, because at the moment, SEPA review the ES and say, yes, if you can, we object unless you condition the requirements of a construction environmental management plan, something like that. And then we're putting a condition saying that we then need to agree that, but once they've got the permission in their hands. So I do think things like that, we should get better at getting that should be agreed before someone has consent or planning permission. But again, we are then being pushed to answer everything within 4 months for a major application. So, but I think on a personal level, and not just in ECA, I think we allow too many conditions that are suspensive, which means they can get their planning permission, but then they have to agree things. Because at the end of the day, it's hard to keep on top of things for everyone, but also the developer knows that we can't then take the permission back if we don't agree. We just endlessly try and steer them in the correct direction of producing the correct information to satisfy the conditions. So without, and this maybe isn't the place without opening it, because we would be here for days. I think that there needs to be a real joined up thing between the planning authority, because also we don't have the specialisms, and we also need to work with people like SEPA who do have the specialisms, to have a two-pronged kind of, actually, not just me sending an email saying, I think you're in breach, we're going to look to resolve that, but actually saying, because one thing, when badger protection, that's quite an easy one, because we can actually quote criminal legislation, even though we're not the ones that follow, but that for once gives us a bit of an edge. So I think if we had that element that we could just at least quote, saying it's not just me wanting to rectify this, it is actually a serious offence, I think we'd start further. But that's a long answer to say at the moment, we're not great. And I suppose one thing, if we object to or refuse an application, it is roughly, because QCs are involved in things in appeals or hearings, it is about £20,000 cost to the council to do a hearing. So we also have to be sure that we're perfectly happy that our grounds for refusal are sound. And if SEPA are saying, well, you can condition this as a SEMP, we would never be able to say, well, okay, we still want to refuse it till that's ironed out. So yeah, and it's just a very depressing view, I'm afraid, but that's just, I just feel we are getting better being joined up, but the legislation is not fit for an actual everyone to get involved in correcting things on site.
Yeah. And sorry, Rebecca, I know it sounds like you're winding up to ask.
No, I'm agreeing. No, I'm nothing and agreeing.
I just wanted to touch on your point about there is a difference between what's written into an ES. So again, going back to an ecology chapter, it'll talk about an ecological clerk of works that has a very specific role, as in they're implementing the mitigation. That's fairly standard through SIEM's definitions and their ideas about what an ECOW is. And so within the ES, you'll have, or in the impact assessment, the application information, you'll have that specified. And then we're talking about a roads order, Rebecca. I actually went back and had a look at some of the information that I've looked at previously, and it's in a roads order for the A9 dualling, where the hydrology chapter talks about the environmental clerk of works ensuring that mitigation will happen. So we as an industry and as planners, if we can separate those two roles, like from a planning perspective, you're there as an assurance role, you're there to check compliance and to report to the local authority that things are happening the way that they should do. But there's, for whatever reason, this ECOW role, this mystical thing that will solve everybody's problems, is sort of used as a very, very broad brush. So now there are hardly any environmental advisors out there. Certainly not enough as there should be. Like every construction contractor should have their own pure environmental team, but they're seeing conditions from the planning authority and conditions contractual agreements that says that there'll be an ECOW on site. And because there's that environmental resource, they don't think that they need to provide that resource. So as Stephen was talking about, and Mike, you're talking about offering landscape architecture advice or MMO advice, that shouldn't, if that's not your role, if the planning authority position is you're there just to monitor compliance, just because you're there doesn't mean that you're absolving the contractor of their responsibility to manage their own environmental management. So we as an industry need to get a lot better at writing what it is that we actually want into a planning or into the impact assessment, and being very specific about that. And then we can hopefully tie that into the planning conditions and say, well, right, so there is going to be whatever you want to call it, an ecological clerk of works or a project ecologist who will do all this stuff. But on top of that, there's going to be an extra layer of due diligence through the planning authority, where there's going to be an environmental clerk of works to monitor whether that ecological clerk of works has done everything that he should have or she should have. So there is a lot of work, and part of this course is about actually raising awareness of the pitfalls of the role, for you guys to go away when you're inputting into environmental statements or providing that resource. You can speak to your clients and say, well, actually, the planning authority condition says this is what I'm to do, and you're now asking me to not only do that, but also implement the mitigation. I can't do that. And then if enough people do that, then we start changing people's perceptions, and we start freeing up the information that allows us to identify where good practice is actually not good practice. So my objection or my statement about silt fencing and hay bales being suitable pollution prevention strategies, we, as an industry, we need to know that that's not okay. And in my opinion, planning authorities should not accept that as sufficient mitigation. And so, yeah, it's about shining a light on what good practice is. And we can only do that if we're free to share that information, which is where the independence comes from. So that's my impassioned speech.
One thing that I'll just note on that is, although we can highlight differences or blurring of or blending of roles on an individual basis, what we're quite conscious of, and I've talked about it with the directors of the association, is we need to be very careful, because this is a really big, dangerous area in terms of, for example, if members of the association basically said to their employer, well, my association has said that I can only do this and I shouldn't do this, so therefore I'm not going to do that. And then that contractor then says, well, I can go and find someone else who will do it, so you're sacked.
Yeah.
We're working at the moment to come up with terms and conditions with a lawyer, and also to strengthen like the association's position, because obviously it's a very dangerous grey area, that, because we basically don't want to be in a position, and don't want a member to be in a position where they said, well, we did what you told us and advised us to do in terms of what the position is, and then I got sacked. So being very mindful of those conversations and what your liabilities are, and taking it on a case-by-case basis, really, and just handling it. I mean, relationships and communication, that's where those softer competencies come into play. Because, you know, if a contractor or an employer is asking you to do something, then it's just a conversation to be had, because, you know, what we've got is not embedded in law, and what our model is and our approach and the good practice, which Simon and I understand, at least, it's not embedded in any legislation. So that's what we're actually trying to do in terms of lobbying, and working with James and others as well. But until it's embedded, which is why we've been involved. Well, that's why the National Planning Framework for us was crucial to get involved with, because we basically said we want to have the role defined, clearly defined in legislation, and then once you've got legislation, then there'll be guidance. But at the moment, we haven't quite made it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If you're sort of take it, be careful with it. But as I say, if the planning condition says, and that's one of the key points, if you can get the planning condition to be consistent, then that should help quite a lot. But for at least increasing awareness, so those writing ESs, if we can get a consistent approach from them as well, then that should hopefully help not put that person in that position.
In terms of enforcement notices then for a breach of a condition, how are those appealed? Is it through judicial review or what's the sort of mechanism?
Yeah, if we serve a notice, well, first of all, we have to make an assessment, and most times we say, well, in the first instance, you have to submit an amended planning application if you're not going to stop what you're doing. But if we feel that we have to, if they don't say we're just going to carry on and we do serve a notice, that you then appeal that to the report, our version of the inspectorate. And again, if something that you want to be dealt with immediately, if you get to appeal it, I mean, that takes at least 8 weeks for the paper, and involves ciphers, etc. So again, that's why we find it's for our enforcement, he'd much rather make veiled threats about other legislation and that you'll get SEEP involved, and be out in sight and things like that, because it's different if someone builds a house without planning permission, because it's not really having that much of an effect, and we can go through the paperwork. But the breaches that we're worried about are the ones, something spilling into a water course or on these sites, and that's where it'd be good if we had something that we could instantly just get on site and say stop. But saying that, SEPA have slightly, well, they can do things like that. So when we liaise with them, that's a big help as well.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the house. If somebody builds a house without planning permission, you flatten it. If somebody spills something into a water course, it's difficult to get it out of that water course.
Yeah. And just as well, I mean, that's the main difference. In England, they have flattened houses, whereas up here we've actually never done that. So
right.
you apply and people say, "Oh, but someone will be living in it." Okay, I won't go into that. But that's the big difference.
Basically, we're big softies in Scotland.
Oh, yes, it's.
Well, I think it's a procreator fiscal system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having in England and elsewhere.
I'm finding it difficult to do. I've just bought a grade 2 listed house, and I'm finding it difficult at the moment. My girlfriend, we need the window widening in the bathroom. I'm like, forget about it. We'll have to get all kinds of reports. Yeah. Just leave it as it is. Forget it.
Yeah, listed building consents and all sorts.
Yeah. She's like, oh, this romantic view of the lovely 1850 grade 2 listed. It's going to cost me 40.
Yeah.
Did you say, sorry, James, just going back to that planning condition, because I'm pretty interested in them. Have you got a variety of different ECAL conditions, or just one or two? I mean, how do you know what's, or just one? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now, and again, hopefully we'll make it much better through the working group, but we tend to just use the one on the screen, because again, you're dictated by the environment, the EIA report. If they're saying it'll be an ecological one dealing with exactly this, it'll be an environmental. And as a planner, I wouldn't feel competent splitting up conditions and things. So that's why, and I think that's what the working group should look at, is it should always be a bit encompassing just environmental, because but it used to be that we'd have other conditions, and I know other local authorities have, and Simon's work proven that, including my own South Lancashire, there's been a big disparity between what we've used. So that's why I think if we can, it's always good to have something quite standard so that it's the same in all 32 authorities, because there's nothing worse than being told, oh, but we were allowed to do this and such, when actually, if we'd all sung from the same hymn sheet, it wouldn't have been allowed.
Maybe the heads of the planning can do some sort of, well, I don't know what's going to come up, but to actually get across, there must be good practice and good examples across the country, and then bad examples. And I think you've got to look at both, to be honest, understand why a bad one doesn't work. But I think there is some sort of lessons learned exercise from a level, and I don't know whether whether other stakeholders can, from south of the border can get involved, but at that stage. But it would be really good to see a selection, and then say, right, these are the ones which are going to be used in these scenarios or these developments, and just consistent across everywhere, basically.
But just to follow those for you guys down in England, as I said, ACAL has a working group with IEMA. It's a post-consent construction phase environmental performance group. It's a bit of a mouthful. But we are looking at, because of ACAO's association with the HOPS working group, the Heads of Planning Scotland, if we can get that definition ECAO condition and prove that it works and it proves that it meets the parameters that we're looking for it to do, then we're looking to use IEMA's sort of influence down in England to promote that across all of the UK, just as good practice. So hopefully, well, the ambition is that once we get the definition from Heads of Planning Scotland and the Energy Consents Unit, we'll start filtering that and pushing that increased monitoring down into England. And I know that Rufus Howard, who's the EIA lead for IEMA, is massively keen on increasing the amount of monitoring that's done during the construction phase. So yeah, as I say, although we're doing a lot of this work up in Scotland, the lessons that we're learning will transpose down into England and the rest of the UK, hopefully not too long after.
Just to let you know, also we've contacted SAIM about the ecological clerks of works role. So we're hoping to have discussion with them to basically hang it together in the same frame, because what we feel we need to do is make that distinction between like the different roles and responsibilities. And there is now what's becoming clearer in terms of what SAIM considers to be an ecological clerks of works, which we may or may not agree with, but then also as an environmental role, as a separate role to that, what that would look like as well. And then we are getting this discussion really about, what's monitoring and what's in, so SAIM, for example, think that they're going down a route saying that an ecological clerks of works will influence, it's not just monitoring, it's more involved, which is fine. We don't necessarily agree with that, but if that's the route they go down, it does actually make it easier to then distinguish between an environmental clerks of works role, which is just there to monitor. So yeah, there is quite a lot of work going on in the industry at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, I think, has anybody got any questions? Okay, I think maybe just to sum up then, the planning authority can impose conditions, will whisper it, but they don't seem to be able to enforce those conditions. But we'll ignore that fact. But yeah, the planning condition is primarily where the role will come from. So unless you're working with SSE are a good example, where they will ask for an environmental clerk of works as part of their contract spec. So do Scottish Power, regardless of the conditions. But typically the role will come from the planning condition. So it's always really useful to have a look at what the planning condition says, to see what your spec is actually, or your scope of works is based on. Yeah, I think that's about it. I don't know if Janet has anything, or if Janet's still there.
Still there.
Okay, cool. Is there anything that you want to add before we finish up?
I don't think so, really. Hopefully you will manage to access the CEPA presentation. We're still waiting for confirmation when they can call in and speak to yourselves. And even if it's after the end of the course, we'll still make sure that is possible. Because as you've seen with James and planning, sometimes it's quite nice to have the opportunity where they're just focused on you for half an hour or an hour just to ask questions or express thoughts. And the more engagement that there is with the industry, the better it is. And CEPA, the contracts that we deal with certainly have that approach as well. They like dealing with people that are working on the ground, particularly right now where there are so many challenges. So I'll keep you posted about that. Our next session is due to be next Tuesday, which is ecology. So it moves topic again slightly, but Philip, who leads that session, I think Simon, you'll be on that session as well, will you?
Yeah.
So that one again is a slightly different focus, and he's got a predominantly marine background, but talks extensively about the kind of legislative side as well as the kind of academic approach that he's taken. So if no one's got any questions, I guess we'll leave it there. As ever, on email if you need me or if you need anything else, and we'll see you next week.
Great.
Thanks very much, guys. All the
Cheers.
best.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.